is my special pleasure this morning to welcome into our midst Bishop-elect Deon. And I am so looking forward, sir, to being able to say Bishop Deon without that elect nonsense stuff. Thank you for being with us. And just to remind everybody that we're doing a special collection offering for today, and the money's going to the Food Insecurity Grant Program, which is to help people who, particularly at this time in the midst of the pandemic, are really suffering hunger and food insecurity. So that's the special offering in honor of Bishop-elect Deon's visitation with us today. So it's good to have you with us, sir. Welcome.
It's good to be with you. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I have a quick question, Bishop, sir. Is it, I thought I read something about a program that a huge grant that was that's being collected.
Yes.
Have we collected at the diocese? And
yeah, that's correct.
How much was that?
So I can speak a bit to it. So one of the things that I realized that we have a bunch of our neighbors who, during the midst of this pandemic, are for the first time looking for food. We have so many people who are out of work, and so food insecurity now has become one of the biggest unspoken needs in our community. And so I was able to, with some monies that were both donated and that were available from the diocese, put together about $30,000 that I've asked to be a matching grant. And so it will go to the Hunger Task Force here in the Diocese of Missouri to be a granting arm for monies for food pantries and food kitchens and all that stuff across the diocese, so that any congregation or any community that's part of the diocese that already has an existing food ministry is able to help those who are in need of food with no questions asked. And so my hope is that we can raise the $60,000, which would be a huge deal, since the Hunger Task Force gives out roughly $20,000 a year. And so to be able to give them $60,000 in 1 year, especially a year like this, would be absolutely amazing. So does that answer your question, Father Joseph?
It does. I did not realize it was 30,000 already. Wow.
Yes. So we started off with 20, and some very generous people said, well, why don't we just make it 30? And so they donated $10,000 to bring it up to 30. And so we could start with $30,000 as our base.
Wow. That's awesome. That's awesome. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Well, St. Peter's, it's great to be with you. I have no agenda with you this morning. So my agenda is simply to be with you, to answer questions, to be present, and to begin to build a relationship. I had hoped to be in this space today, but we are here. We're still in a virtual world, and it means though that I get to be in your living room and your kitchen and your dining room, and I see some people out in their backyard, and so I have been more places in the last 8 weeks than I ever thought I could, including New Zealand, which I'm sure will make Father Rob really happy. I got to Skype with one of our postulants who is in New Zealand, and so that was I can safely say that I have now gone all over the world via Zoom. But as I said, this is an opportunity for us to just be engaged in questions and to talk with each other and to meet with each other. So feel free in the chat, or if you wave, I should be able to see you and I can try to answer some of the questions that you might have.
Bishop-elect Deon,
Yes, Kelly.
could you just tell us a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, where your church was before you moved to St. Louis?
Sure. So I'm originally from Barbados. Barbados is a small Caribbean island, 166 square miles, that is just north of South America. And I moved to New York when I was about 14 or so. Well, not or so, I was 14. And spent most of my high school time in New York, just outside the city, so Westchester County. And then I went off to Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio, for college. And after that, I went back to New York. I seem to end up going back to New York since my family's there. I went back to New York for seminary. I went to General Theological Seminary, and then back to Ohio. So I spent almost 4 years in Ohio as a priest associate at one of the parishes in Shaker Heights. And then I was called to the Diocese of Michigan. And so I was there for the last 14 years, up until November 23rd or so, when a certain diocese of Missouri said, oh, by the way, we'd like you to come to be our next bishop. And, you know, there were no tears or anything that day. It was just another day like any other. But it's been a joy to kind of make that journey. And we moved to the St. Louis area February 20th. So we've been here for a little bit. And I started working in the diocesan offices March 1st. And then everything shut down, and then I've been working and living on Zoom. So I think about 2 weeks ago, I spent 37 hours on Zoom, just with meetings and meeting new people and visiting and all that stuff. So as I said, I've gone on so many Zoom vacations and so many Zoom trips that I should be getting frequent flyer miles right about now, but I don't think they would be good for anything. But nonetheless, so, and as you know, the ordination consecration was planned originally for April 25th, but because of safety reasons and our pandemic, the presiding bishop asked to move it to June 13th. So June 13th is the date. It's going to look a lot different than what we had planned. There'll only be 25 people in the cathedral for the ordination, but it will be live streamed. And you will get to sit and be comfortable wherever you would like to be to watch it. I hope you'll tune in to be there present. And the good thing about it being moved to June 13th is the presiding bishop gave us permission to celebrate Bishop Barbara Harris. As some of you may know, she was the very first female bishop in the entire Anglican Communion, and her 90th birthday would have been June 12th. And so we get to celebrate her commemoration on June 13th as part of my ordination. So, fun fact. Other questions?
And she just died earlier this year, is that right?
Yes, she just died in March, and she was one of my mentors since I was in seminary. So I've known her for almost 20 years. So her loss during this pandemic is a hard one, but you know, she had this wonderful phrase that hallelujah anyway, hallelujah anyway. I see in the chat we have a couple of questions. Can you tell us your thoughts on rector searches in the diocese? Thanks. Well, I'm a firm believer that each community is slightly different. And I'm not necessarily a fan of a one size fits all. Each context is unique, and each context is different. And I know that you are in the midst, well, not quite in the midst of, but preparing for a rector search. And you have the amazing Rob Voyle as your interim rector. If I could, I think his wife would probably murder me if I suggested him staying in the Diocese of Missouri, but we will enjoy him while we have him. I've been a big fan of his appreciative way for a while, so having him in the diocese is truly a blessing. But I know that a lot of the searches are going to be a lot different than they were before. And the reality is we are going to have to take a little bit of extra time to really craft and figure out who each congregation is, especially for you, St. Peter's, to figure out who you are and who God is calling to walk with you in your next journey. I can tell you across the church, a lot of the searches are on hold or have been postponed indefinitely. We have a few dioceses that have bishop elections that were supposed to happen, that all of that has been put on pause until the pandemic is at least behind us, and we'll see what comes next. So I suspect that kind of taking this interim time to be prayerful, to be discerning what God is calling you to be, is probably a good thing, especially now. So, and then let's see, the other question is, what is the current schedule for reopening churches in the diocese? As I said before, I'm not the type of person that is like, this is how it's going to be. I'm much more, your context matters. I mean, St. Peter's is a unique context compared to, say, Holy Cross, Poplar Bluff. So a one-size-fits-all reopening doesn't really work. What my office has said is, starting June 1st, tomorrow, congregations can submit plans for how they can safely regather, provided that there are a couple criteria that are met. One is that there's a decline in our COVID-19 cases, that the building is thoroughly cleaned, that testing is available for those who would need to or want a test, and that the plan is submitted to the bishop's office, not for approval, but just so that we can say, hey, this might be something you might be thinking that might be helpful. And so we've sent the clergy a lot of, and most of the congregations, a lot of resources to help in how they could reopen safely. Because my big thing is, I want to make sure that all of you are safe. One of the vows that I'm going to take June 13th is to guard the people and the unity of the church. And my biggest fear would be that one of our congregations become a hotspot for another outbreak, or that one of our clergy inadvertently pass on something to one of the members of the congregation. So I've let each congregation come up with their own context. And so I suspect St. Peter's is coming up with their own plan on how they're going to safely reopen. I can tell you from looking at several of the plans that have come in, most of our congregations are waiting until July to decide on whether they're going to open or not. So, what can the Episcopal Church in Missouri, and specifically St. Peter's Church, do to support the protest against racial injustice? Well, thank you, Meredith. I can safely say that the events that have happened the last couple of months in our nation hits pretty close to home. I can see myself in George Floyd. I can see my 8-year-old son in George Floyd. So this hits home. The night after the video of George Floyd came out, I said an extra prayer over my son as I put him to bed. I said a prayer for the world that he's going to inherit, and I said a prayer for him for his safety. And so the best way that you can help support those who are out protesting, and mind you, I have to say, I'm not condoning the violence that's happening in some of our cities. The protest, because I went to the county protest yesterday to stand with our clergy and to represent our diocese there. I can safely say that the best way that you can be a help in the midst of this is to simply raise your voice, to speak out, to not be silent. The thing is, in a society in which we live, I can pretty quickly be dismissed as an angry Black man. And the real work of change is the work that people who don't look like me are going to have to affect, because I'm easily dismissed. No matter the title, I can be bishop or archbishop or, you know, Your Eminence the Pope. I don't think that one's going to happen anytime soon, but regardless of my title, in some places, only the color of my skin is what's going to be seen. One of the more powerful images that I saw from some protest this weekend was the images of predominantly white moms standing, holding hands in front of a group of predominantly Black younger men, between them and the police. And for me, that was a heartwarming image to see that, hey, here are allies standing in support of and standing with people of color who who are often dismissed in our society. And so, as I said, while I don't condone the violence, I understand the aching, the yearning for a sense of safety. I mean, at some point, I have to have the talk with my son. And the talk is not about the birds and bees. The talk is about how he is going to interact with the police if he ever has to. The talk is about how he has to act if he goes to a party and the police shows up that he cannot run. The talk that I'm going to have to give him is a very different talk than most parents have to give to their children. But for better or for worse, that is the nation that we're living in. And my hope is that this will be a catalyst for us to be agents of reconciliation and change that starts with the church. I know I said a lot in that, but other questions? You have a rather quiet group here, Rob.
That's very rare.
Zoot.
I would like to know what some of your, really major hopes and goals are as you come into your new position.
Oh, Jane Gilbert just asked the exact same question.
I know, I saw that.
Well, I don't come with a list of, these are the things that I want to accomplish in my first year. One of my major goals has been to spend a lot of time listening, to just hear the hopes and dreams of the diocese, of, the clergy, to just spend time getting to know everyone. And so one of the things I've been doing, and that's part of the reason why I'm spending so much time on Zoom, is that I have been doing town halls kind of like this with us, especially with the congregations that are much further out, to kind of hear what their hopes and dreams are. And the same thing is true for you. I had some questions that I will leave you with before we're done. But one of the things that I'm really, really wanting to do is to make sure that we feel as though we are one church and a bunch of different locations. What I mean by that is, if St. Peter's is doing well, it means that Kirksville is doing well and Poplar Bluff is doing well, that we're all one set of Episcopalians. We're just in a bunch of different locations so that we can see ourselves as one church, not just as individual congregations doing our thing, but seeing that we're connected to each one across the diocese. And so part of that too is working with ecumenical partners. So I've started a conversation with the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America Bishop, Susan Candia, about some places that we can work together, the Episcopal Church and the Lutheran Church. We've had some conversations already with the Diocese of Western Missouri to see where we can partner and do things together. So I really am hoping that we can see ourselves as one church. Specifically for the diocese, my hope is at some point soon to begin the work of planning and doing a strategic plan for the whole diocese, something that we can all get behind as some goals for all of us. But all of that begins with listening. And so I plan on doing a lot of listening before we formulate any kind of plan. Oh, I saw some questions pop up in the chat. Have you started your backyard chicken flock yet? Yes, I have. We have 3 chickens. We call them the Trinity of chickens. And my 8-year-old, who was just here for Children's Chapel and is back upstairs, he got the pleasure of naming them. And so our chickens are Omelet, Drumstick, and Nugget. I will just drop that there and leave it alone. So, but the chickens are doing quite well. And the chicken namer just walked in. Come here, you want to say hi? What? Say hi. Whoop.
Hi.
I may have to turn off our virtual background. There you are.
You couldn't see me?
Now they can see you.
Ow.
Now they can see you.
Hey, John.
Hey. Wait, where?
Right there.
Oh.
Do you want to tell the bishop?
There's like so many people I can't find it.
Go ahead, go get your water.
Okay, can I have some ice with it?
Yes.
Chris, do you
Parenting
wanna
and
take a
preaching. That's, I'm
minute
going to write my new
before
book.
Bishop's out there?
I'm sorry, Rob, go ahead.
I was just gonna ask Chris to tell you why chickens are so important to him and what he's doing in Haiti with chickens.
Oh,
He's also a culinary
Oh.
genius.
I like eating chickens too. No, well, thanks, Rob. In fact, I just forwarded an updated message from our from John Dutton, who is leading the Outreach Haiti effort. But yeah, so Outreach Haiti is about a 20-plus-year-old mission that was started by parishioners of Church of the Good Shepherd in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And we were fortunate enough to share some of their congregants for a period of time in the Duttons. And we agreed to join them in this mission. It's a school and a church, both of which were built by members of the congregation of Church of the Good Shepherd. And they've continued to support this school, a mountaintop school in Petite Harpon, an awesome place. We're trying to, we've tried several times to get an additional trip down there for some St. Peter's folks, but haven't been able to manage it with a lot of the social unrest, and now COVID is there as well.
Yeah.
However, on my first trip down there, we were talking with the rector about his wish list. What are the kinds of things he wanted for his community? And they have a school lunch program that operates pretty much year round. And he wanted that lunch program is funded by the support of St. Peter's and other parishes. And what he was wanting to do is to be able to produce some of their own food. They're mostly subsistence farmers there, a lot of yams and potatoes and corn. They have some chickens, usually on a string attached to a back door somewhere. But he was an agronomist prior to being a rector there, and he wanted to know if we could figure out a way to grow some chickens. So as it turns out, I've spent about 35 years being a chicken nutritionist in a company here in St. Louis, and doing a lot of work globally. And so with some of the contacts I had in my visits down there, we've managed to arrange for day-old chicks and feed, and we've manufactured some metal chicken buildings, loaded them into a container, and shipped them down there, where unfortunately they still sit safely, but stay in, they're in Petite Harpon right now through customs and in a safe place, but we've not been able to get it organized to get them to the mountain, to get them built, to get this whole project started. But I'm all for any kind of backyard chicken flocks, and support the chickens, support the egg.
well, thank you. If I have any chicken dietary needs, I'll be sure to. Chris Knight, duly noted. Well, and I saw in the chat, how much of a St. Louis Cardinals fan are you? Hold on.
While the bishop is coming back, who's the big competitor with the Cardinals? Who's the enemy, folks?
All right. That would be the dreaded Chicago Cubs, Rob.
Chicago Cubs?
So you are officially a Cardinal, actually.
I'm officially a Cardinal. I will be, once I'm ordained, I'll be one of the only Episcopal bishops that's a Cardinal.
Oh, very good. Well, when the games resume, we have many fans. Bruce and Linda Wright are two of our biggest ones here on the call. Many fans who will make sure you get to go to games.
I will take you up on that offer.
Well, the thing that's really cool about where we're at with the whole influence of the pandemics, you realize that the Cardinals remain unbeaten this entire season, while those losers up in Chicago haven't won a game all season.
Well, and the St. Louis Blues continue to be the Stanley Cup champions.
I may take a page from your book, Rob. I think Den had a question. Oh,
Let me
you're
just
muted.
unmute you.
There you are.
There
Sorry,
you go again. Yeah.
if it's all right, I'm enjoying the appreciative way, and you mentioned you were familiar with the appreciative way prior to well, to not this time, and I had a sense that maybe your understanding that sort of one size fits all doesn't fit very well, that maybe the appreciative way in your perspective would contribute to that sense of, you know, trying to appreciate context.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's, I mean, I've always been a big fan of your context makes a difference. And so, as I said, what works here at St. Peter's may not necessarily work down at Holy Cross Poplar Bluff or Trinity Kirksville. And so each place is unique, and but I think the challenges are almost always the same. We always have a challenge as Episcopalians of being evangelists, you know, going and telling our story. Finances, rather, is always a challenge in the church. And so I think some of the challenges are the same, but how we approach those challenges and how we face them as communities is definitely contextual. So, and I suspect Rob could say a lot more about that than I could.
Well, actually, I think part of what I'd be curious about, it was kind of cool listening to Chris and I in conversations about part of his passion in terms of what he's doing, and looking at mission as an expression of sharing what we love with the people that we love. And that I think of evangelism. That's and so I have a question for you, Bishop-elect. What, beyond being with your family, what do you love to do?
Well, I love to, cooking is one of the things that I love to do. And so usually in my house, it's a struggle between about who's going to cook. Because my mother's with us as well. My mother lives in New York City, but she happened to fortunately be with us for the move to help take care of my son. And so she's been here since we've moved, and she won't be going back to New York for a while. And so in our house, it's kind of like rock, paper, scissors to see who's going to cook for the evening, because we all really like to cook. So cooking is one of my passions. I spend way too much time reading, and well, you can never have too much time reading, but I spend a lot of time reading, and I've become somewhat of an armchair movie critic. So in between my Zoom meetings, I'm usually watching some movie or show, and I find that most movies have at least some theological piece that I can use in a sermon somewhere, because I'm convinced that God speaks in just about any realm, but particularly so in movies. There's always some moment that I can look and go, there's part of the story of God being unfolded in front of us. So those are a couple of things I like to do. I love to go hiking and walking. And so we usually go for a walk near the end of the day during this time. And I love to travel, but that's not happening right now. So.
So would you recommend the Instapot?
I would definitely recommend the Instapot. God is like an Instapot, not a microwave. I recommend, we just got one a couple of weeks ago, and it is perhaps like the best thing ever. It sautés, I mean, I almost feel like one of those infomercials. It sautés, it slow cooks, it pressure cooks, and there's more. But I would highly recommend one of them. We did the first recipe we did were baby back ribs in the Instant Pot, and wow is all I could say.
Cool. So I'm curious, just to dig a little deeper, what part of cooking do you really love?
Well, see, so I'm from the Caribbean, and we don't our cooking tends to be I call it like experimental cooking more than anything else, because we don't follow recipes. I had a friend of mine that was asking me about like making a drink that comes from the Caribbean, and I said, well, you put some of this, you put some of that, and he's like, no, give me the measurements. I'm like, we don't have measurements. It's kind of like you just know, you put in enough, you taste it, like, okay, that tastes about right. And so I think it's the experimental, the coming together of flavors. Like for instance, I made this tamarind rice the other day that really shouldn't work when you think of those flavors. Tamarind is pretty sour, tamarind is pretty intense, and rice, but with just the right combination, it is a really good dish. And so for me, it's the bringing those dishes together that the flavors that may not necessarily may not necessarily go together, but somehow you can make them work. And so it's a figuring it out.
Well, that's part of that question, what do you love to do, is my favorite. If I only had one question to ask anybody, that would be what it is. And as I've shared with many of the people on the call today, that these things that we really love to do are actually metaphors for why we're on the face of the earth. And it makes total sense that if you don't cook with a recipe, then one size doesn't fit all. It's like you've got to go and cook with what food's here. And so if you go to a congregation in one place, we have to make a meal and make something gracious out of what we have available. And so you can't just simply have one size fits all. There is no one fixed recipe for the church. So that whole, you can see how that metaphorically works together in terms of how we are in the world, and the idea of being experimental and creative. And it is in those moments, even watching a movie, that we find the Spirit is at work.
Well, see, my image of the church is a big potluck. And if you want to talk about experimental and taking chances, potluck.
Not if the nights are going to be there. It's going to be good if the nights are there.
but you end up with, if you, anytime you do a potluck, you end up with, nobody really knows what anybody else is bringing. And food shows up, and somehow you put your plate with a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and somehow all of it works together. And to me, that, especially on this Pentecost Sunday, that is a really good image for me of the church. We are a big potluck, and somehow you fill your place with the pieces that you need, and you are fed. So, other questions?
Catherine has a question as to what you mean as and you've got ally, but is it ally,
ally.
Or
Ally.
what have you got? Hang on, is that true, Kath? Yeah.
You used the word, I think, when you were talking about the white moms holding hands. And I think the concept of ally is rich, but I would love to hear you talk more about what that means to you.
Okay. Well, I'm going to use a biblical image for that. After Jesus' crucifixion and after his resurrection, the disciples were walking towards Emmaus. And, the stranger shows up and starts walking alongside them. He doesn't go in front. He doesn't push from behind. He simply walks alongside them as their companion on the road to Emmaus. And it turned out that that person was Jesus. And they didn't realize it was him until they got to their destination. For me, that is the work of an ally. It's coming alongside someone else and being a voice when they have no voice, being hands when they can't act. It's being a companion with, and showing compassion for the other. So in places that might be dangerous for me, someone else going along with me is an ally. In places where, you know, like for instance, if you're in a space where off-color jokes that may have a racial tent or a racial bent might be said, being an ally is, you know, my person of color friend that is not here isn't here, but I can stand up and say, you know, that is not acceptable. So me, I really see an ally as the person who like Jesus, companions with us in this journey. Because I mean, we're all in this together, whether we like it or not. I mean, I think this pandemic is showing that we are really all in this, like it or not. We're all in the same boat. And so having some folks who can speak with and for and companion along with us, I think that that will make a big difference in this society. I look at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, and imagine what would happen if we did something like that here in the United States. Because there wasn't judgment, it was companionship. They heard hard stories, but it was people being allies with each other. It was walking next to each other. And so that's kind of my quick definition. You're welcome. Other questions? No, it's not every day that you have a bishop-elect captive for about an hour, so. And the good thing is I can see all of your names. So if you don't have questions, I have some questions for you.
Well, I have
What are your questions?
Oh, I think Marilyn 222 at AOL just jumped in.
She has an email address on that.
Yes.
Wait, what you've touched on this, but what else? This is Bob and Marilyn Evans. You've touched on what came with you from Barbados. What else can you speak of on your first 14 years that you brought with you to your current position?
Well, I can tell you one of the things that has come with me is the village. What I mean by that, I grew up, like I said, I grew up in Barbados with in a relatively small village. And if you've ever visited or been in a small village, you know that everybody knows all of your business all the time. But they're also concerned about everyone rather than just the person. And so for me, I always see it as, I see the church, I see the work going forward of being bishop, that it's not about me, it's about all of us. That we are in this together, that we are one church. And the decisions that I get to make, the direction that we get to go together is about all of us. That's why I said, you know, we are all one big Episcopal family in a bunch of different locations. And so when we all do well, when St. Peter's does well, all of us does well. And so for me, that's kind of my image, and that's one of the big things that I think that I bring, that sense that we are the village.
I love that. Let me, I would even add that we are, as Christianity, we are one church.
Exactly.
But and I bow to my age. I forgot the next question.
That is okay. It's what my grandmother used to call practicing to be old.
Yeah, there you go.
I saw a question in the chat. What are your favorite movies? Oh, good Lord, there's so many. If you had to ask me my favorite movie, it would be Lord of the Rings. That is an absolutely amazing movie. I highly recommend it. I did, the final installment came out the year that I was about to take the general ordination exams. And so instead of studying, I spent 12 hours in a movie theater watching the entire trilogy of Lord of the Rings from the beginning to the end, 2 days before taking the exams. So that was my preparation. I'm sorry, Rob, go ahead.
I was going to say, I grew up about 30 miles from Middle Earth.
I am so jealous. So very jealous.
Oh, wait, I see a diocesan trip to New Zealand led by you guys. That could be fun.
I will gladly go. It's on my bucket list of places to go visit.
And Brian would love to know what kind of music we'd listen to while we're on that journey.
Well, see, I grew up with 70s music playing in my house. So, you know, all the Diana Rosses and Aretha Franklins, and so yeah, that we would be rocking to divas of the 70s. So, Charlie had a question. YMCA, of course. How can we go about making our diocese one church in multiple locations? What are the biggest challenges of the diocese, and how will you address them? I would say that simply by having the conversation about it, simply pointing out that, you know, we are one church in multiple locations, because I think what's happened, and it's not just the Diocese of Missouri, it's happened across the Episcopal Church. We've become kind of insular in a sense, that we only look at our own community and like what's going to be good for us. And I think in doing that, we put the emphasis on the wrong syllable. What we've done is we've stopped looking at, we're in this together. We really are, you know, and the Diocese of Missouri, we're 11,000 Episcopalians spread out across 43 congregations. And we need to put it the other way around, you know, we need to put it in that way, that we are Episcopalians in 42 locations. So, you know, if you get up and go to Calvary in Columbia, the service is going to look pretty much the same like what you're accustomed to at St. Peter's. The music might be different, how they express it is different, but it's the same. It's the same thing. And recognizing that when when one of us does well, all of us does well. I remember the time, I mean, I grew up in a time we call them parish churches, and I think Rob might be familiar with those, where you had a big church in one location, and all the other churches around it were either founded by that church, and they all constantly came back and forth around each other. So they didn't see themselves as, you know, one little parish here. They saw themselves as part of the bigger parish. And then they were individual kind of like homes in that parish. So each small congregation had a connection to the wider, you know, to the wider parish. And so that's one of the things that I'm hopeful for in the diocese, that we can see ourselves as we're all in this together. We're all one. We're just doing things in our own context that's different.
That's part of the reason why New Orleans and Louisiana, we still have parishes. We don't have counties, we have parishes.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, Barbados had that same type of thing. We had 11 parishes, and there was a parish church in every parish, and then there were smaller churches inside of each in the parish geography. So it's yeah, I mean, for me, that's my vision, that it's like that we can just see ourselves as, you know, forget geography. Let's just see ourselves as one church, and what we do benefits everyone.
Kelly, doesn't St. Peter's have a history of that?
Yes, St. Peter's founded
four parishes.
4 parishes?
Yeah, Good Shepherd. No, what was in Warson Woods is closed now. So St. Matthew's, right?
St. Matthew's, St. James.
And yeah, and St. Luke's, right?
So when you're founding another parish?
Yeah.
Transfiguration also.
You have a history of founding parishes. So when are you founding another parish?
Well, we haven't done it since the 60s, but there you go.
I think you're overdue.
Yeah.
Chicken farm in Haiti may be the first thing.
That's a good start. So, well, that might be my challenge to you. My challenge would be to think about when is St. Peter's going to live into that DNA that you have and found another parish.
I think a question I have is, with the parishes we have now, is how to really be more evangelical and bringing more people into our parishes. Because that's a concern I can certainly see, that that a trend has been for it not to increase but decrease. St. Peter's, I think, has been very fortunate But I think others have not.
Yeah. Well, here's the interesting thing that has happened in the Episcopal Church. We've, for the last couple of decades, we've begun to focus on our internally rather than externally. Evangelism at its heart is just simply telling our stories. I mean, Jesus didn't go out and tell anybody to come to church. Jesus didn't go out and say to people, hey, meet me at the synagogue at 11 o'clock on Saturday afternoon or Saturday morning. What Jesus did is he told stories. Now, all of us have stories that we can share. I mean, here's a perfect example. When I was back in Michigan a couple years ago, I had friends of mine that I would go spend time with on the weekends, or you go do movies or go sit and have a drink or something. And so we would talk about our weekends. And I would talk about everything that happened in my weekend and never mention church. It didn't even occur to me until I finally went, wait, why am I not mentioning church? So I started mentioning, well, granted, I was the only priest at the congregation. The sermon was just spectacular this past Sunday. The preacher was just right on and everything was just ideal. I mean, I just started mentioning some of the stuff that was happening to church, and guess what started happening? People, my friends, started inviting themselves to church. They were like, oh, I didn't know that you that you were at that parish. Oh, I need to come hear you, or I need to come see you that the social justice program that you all are doing, or something like that. Oh, I want to come help out at your food pantry. Once we start telling our stories, I mean, all of us have stories of when we lost a loved one and what the members of our church did for us. They sent us cards, they called, they brought us food. The Episcopalians will feed you and feed you and feed you. But being able to tell those stories to our friends is a way of inviting them to come and be part of it. And so one of the things that I've done, and I don't know if you all saw the ICEEK last week, but I've hired Whitney Rice to be the canon for evangelism and discipleship development. And when I talked in the walkabouts about making evangelism a priority in the diocese, I really meant it. And so she was my very first hire, that we're going to have somebody whose job it is to kind of engage the congregations and figuring out what that work of evangelism looks like. So I do take that seriously. And my hope is, someone asked me, what's my big, hairy, audacious dream for the diocese? My hope is that by the time I retire, we have doubled the size of this diocese. If we're gonna go big, let's go all the way big. Does that answer the question,
one
Linda?
of the things, I think the other thing, and that I think of it when I listen to what you're saying about sharing, a big piece of it is to change our focus. And it's not about getting people into the church, it's getting the people in the church out of the church, out into the world, engaged with the world. And it's as we in the church go out and engage.
Yeah. And
that is where it's like, you do that? Wow, I think I'd like to be part of that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it's at the end of the service, a deacon or priest or someone says, go. I wish sometimes that the deacon would just stop there. We always say, go forth into the world, loving, serving, go in peace to love and serve. I wish sometimes the deacon would just say, go. That is the most actionable word in Christianity, that we are sent to go. Go out, you can't stay here, go. Go out into the world and make a difference.
That ties into a really good question in the chat. I think it's Kelly who wrote it.
How do you think our current virtual circumstance might influence us going forward? Well, I think that we will recognize that our buildings are simply tools and not the centers that they always have to be. I think we're going to recognize that we are a lot more connected to each other, and that we're going to want that connection to continue. One of the things that I've learned in all this Zoom and connectivity is that we are so connected, and people want that connection. People want a sense of, that someone is taking care of and praying for and being with them. mean, I look at the rise of social media, you know, at its heart, what's Facebook and Twitter and Instagram about? It's about connection. It's about wanting to be connected. And I think that once this pandemic is over, as a church, we have an amazing opportunity to invite people into a deeper sense of connection with each other, with God, and with the church. Not necessarily in that order. So, being mindful of the time, I have some questions for you. And see, Rob will appreciate some of these questions. These are 3 questions that I have been asking every single congregation that I have spent any time with. I've asked it of the diocesan staff, and I've asked it of every person that I encounter. So I'll ask you the same 3 questions. In the Diocese of Missouri, for you, what is working well and what do you want more of? Rob will recognize those first 2, that first question in one. What do you want more of? The second question is, how can the bishop's office be helpful in our shared ministry? Now notice the phrase that I use, not in your ministry, but in our shared ministry. Because I really do see us as that one church spread out across geography into 43 different locations. And I see the ministry at St. Peter's as part of my ministry and part of all of our ministry. And how can I and my office be helpful to you in the ministry that we share together? Where are the places that we can partner? For instance, like maybe trying to get those chicken coops up on the mountain in Haiti. That might be something the bishop's office could be helpful with, who knows? But how can we be helpful in our shared ministry? And the last question is one that is often a bit challenging for most people, most congregations, but I would challenge you anyway. The last question gets at the heart of who we are. And it's, what are we willing to let go of so that something new can grow here? What are we willing to let go of so that something new can grow here? What I mean by that is, as Christians, as Episcopalians, we talk a lot about resurrection. You know, all of us want the church to grow. We all want young families. We want financial stability, all of that stuff. And that's all resurrection. But we don't often talk about the Good Friday, the letting go part. What are some of the things we have to let go of so that something new can happen? And I'll give you a perfect example. At the parish that I came from, when I first got there, we had no children. No, I shouldn't say that. We had very few children. There were very few young families and very few children. And the vestry and I spent an entire vestry meeting on our knees in the building. We weren't praying. What I had the vestry do was to walk around the building and look at the building from the perspective of a child. What do we see? And guess what we found out? We found out, especially in worship, that the main things that children see are butts. There's a sermon in there somewhere, but I'm going to leave that sermon for another time. But we didn't want the message for our kids to be church is a bunch of butts. And so what we ended up doing is we took out a whole bunch of pews near the front so that we could put in a soft space and some rocking chairs for young moms and young dads with their young kids so that they would feel welcome. Even though we didn't have them, we wanted to make sure that if they walked in, they felt comfortable and welcomed. And so we took out a bunch of pews and put in a soft space. And I said to the congregation, you know, one of the things you're going to have to give up for a while is the fact that kids are going to be not going to be sitting in a pew, that they're going to be running up and down the aisles for a little bit, that they're going to be making noise at the worst time in the service, but that's okay. And once they began to do that, we started seeing young families showing up. And one of the unforeseen circumstances that we didn't quite recognize is that in putting in rocking chairs for young moms and young dads, all of our senior saints somehow managed to take over all of the rocking chairs. So apparently our senior saints liked having rocking chairs in church. And so we put in more rocking chairs to allow people to feel more comfortable. And what ended up happening is our senior saints were sitting in the rocking chairs and all the young moms and dads would give them the babies. So you would see these these folks who were grandparents rocking with these little babies and these little toddlers in their arms, and it changed the church, but it meant that we had to let go of something. So my question goes back to, what are we willing to let go of so that something new can grow here? So those 3 questions are the 3 questions that I'm hoping once we're together in person, that I'm able to visit, that we will begin our conversation around those 3 questions. Rob, anything to add?
Cool. No, I think if we could answer those 3 questions, we'd be way down the road. And in some ways, I think, and Chris Knight, who we heard from before, is the chickens. He's also the head of the search committee. And I think those are really 3 questions that we as a congregation need to be answering in terms of who we are, and to figure out what is it that we want to grow, and what is the cost? What are we going to have to let go of? And so I think those are important questions that we as a congregation need to be asking and answering as part of our search process. So I think Chris and the work of the search committee are working on aspects of that and how we have those conversations. And it's a huge challenge given the changed circumstance, because I know a lot of the conversations that I would have hoped to have been having during, say, Lent, we haven't been able to have. And we are looking at ways of maybe doing some of that virtually in June, not in terms of having a conversation like we're currently having, where you've got lots and lots of people and one big Zoom call doesn't really work well. Yeah. But maybe we can figure out the technology to put people into breakout rooms and do that kind of thing, where we can maybe have 6 or 7 people in a small group and then all coming back together. So that's for the conversation. I think the search committee is also looking at doing a survey, and a big piece of it is I think to answer those three questions. And
well, if you need some help in figuring out how that Zoom's splitting into small groups, by all means, call my office. Janice Greenbaum, our communications director, is an expert on how to kind of do those small group, and bring us back together, because we do it with clergy every Wednesday.
Yeah, and actually it's been working well. I can let you know, but yeah, we get together all through the pandemic. We've been getting together every Wednesday, and as part of that, we break out into small groups, and I think that has been helpful as part of the whole connection. So, well, I'm mindful of the time as well.
Well, I'll say thank you all so very much for allowing me to be in your living room and kitchen and backyard and all the places in between. It has been a joy for me, and it's always a joy to be with you, and I so look forward to being with you in person. And the way I usually end all of these is by saying, be safe, stay well, wash your hands, wear a mask, pray often.
Amen.
Amen.
Good to see you all. Enjoy the day.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.